I doubt that he was talking about Harry Potter. Any accumulated wealth was to be reinvested to further one's efforts and to accumulate even more wealth and evidence of one's status among the elect. So wealthy people, and this is how wealthy people talk about themselves. The reason that they're rich is because they're better than everybody else. They were chosen by God to have all this money. So what does that mean? Who's the richest man in the United States?
The one who sweat the most?
Yeah. So who was chosen by God to be the richest man in the United States right now?
With money?
Yeah. Bill Gates.
Yeah, Bill Gates.
Who's number 3? The guy that was running for the Democratic candidacy. And he used to talk about all this money he had all the time. He put $115 million into his campaign, and he dropped out last night. He got his butt kicked in Super Tuesday, and he dropped out last night.
Who's that?
Michael Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, okay.
But Bloomberg is Jewish, so he can't be a Protestant selected person. But he's already Jewish, and Jewish people are the chosen ones. I know. They are the select group of people that God chose. As exciting as all that is. I'm not a Protestant, I'm Jewish, I'm not Navajo. Obviously I'm not a chosen person for anything. Damn. Modern capitalism, as Weber viewed it, was thus concerned with the accumulation of wealth for its own sake and not for the sake of material pleasures that it brought. As a matter of fact, if you are wealthy and you enjoy your wealth, you have tainted your wealth. You have tainted it. So you can't enjoy it. So what Trump does, he parties and he builds buildings, and then he takes the nicest rooms, the Trump Tower in New York City. See, he's not really supposed to do that. If he were a good Christian, he wouldn't do that. If he were a good Christian, he would take his money and he would keep accumulating his money, but he wouldn't enjoy it, like the Waltons do. They don't have mansions. They don't spend their money and they're not really showy about all the wealth that they have. Why not? Because they're from Arkansas and they're Baptists. And Baptists are not showy, wealthy people. As weird as that is. Are you excited yet? Okay, so if I were a good Christian, I would work my ass off, I would make a lot of money, but I wouldn't tell anybody about it.
Oh. Yeah.
Okay. But I could be generous, but I couldn't have a good time. And what do I tell you guys? I'm just here for a good time. That's what I keep telling everybody. Okay.
So you're not Christian?
Obviously, I'm not a Christian. Because I'm just here for a good time. A recent analysis found that Protestants and people living in Protestant societies were generally considered they generally consider the prospect of being unemployed as more of a blow to their well-being than non-Protestants living in non-Protestant societies do. So a lot of people don't mind being unemployed. As a matter of fact, if you go wander around the world and you look at the people that aren't employed, it doesn't seem to bother them a whole lot. If you go to England, for example, and you talk to the people in England, there's a lot of people in England that don't work. But they do survive, and the way that they survive is that they are on the dole. In other words, they get a select amount of money. They're on welfare. So they get a select amount of money. But it doesn't seem to bother them a whole lot to be on the dole, to be somebody that's not working. But if you see people in the United States, and this is one of the reasons why we have such a huge argument about welfare, because we are basically a Protestant nation, and since we're a Protestant nation, being on welfare is insulting, it's embarrassing. So for Protestant countries, to have a lot of people on welfare is an insult and an embarrassment. So that's what, so we have this cadre of individuals who are against welfare, and they're mostly evangelists. They're religious fundamentalists. They're the ones that are against welfare, as bizarre as that is. They don't want food stamps. So we keep having these arguments about how much welfare should we have in the United States. Once upon a time, there was a president by the name of Reagan, and he decided that he was going to paint the picture of people on welfare as black and accumulating as much as they could while they were on welfare. So he talked about welfare mothers who were just had babies so that they could get more welfare money, that they were buying Cadillacs. They were driving around in Cadillacs, and they didn't work. They just got money from the government. Because in a Protestant society, as you know, Reagan was a Republican, in a Protestant society, that's embarrassing. That's an insult to the country. So now that Trump is the president, one of the things he talked about in his State of the Union address this time was the fact that there are 4 million less people on welfare than there were last year. He's bragging about the fact that there are fewer people, and theoretically those people could be working, but he said it as if he were saying, I kicked 4 million people off of welfare. That's the way that he presented it, as interesting as that is. Cheating as that is.
Or basically just like, yeah, kicking people off welfare at the same time, it's like, or he's like trying to make people look like he's helping these people that were on welfare.
That's not the way he said it.
But then in reality, it's like he's just kicking them off.
He's just kicking them off. He just kicked them off. The other thing is homeless people. Homeless people are probably not working people. And of course, he never talks about the number of homeless people increasing in the United States, despite the fact that we have the lowest the lowest unemployment rate that we've had in 50 years. We still have more homeless people. There's got to be a reason for that. In the early 21st century, a study revealed that Protestant nations were far more industrialized than their Catholic counterparts, and religious differences accounted for much of that. So we do have Catholic countries around the world. Most of the South American countries are Catholic. All the South American countries are Catholic. Some of the European countries are Catholic. Italy, Spain, France. France is kind of maybe yes, maybe no. Germany, southern Germany is Catholic. Northern Germany is Lutheran. England is Protestant. Scotland is Protestant. The Netherlands are Protestant. Belgium is Protestant. So if we look at the Protestant countries around the world, Australia is Protestant. Canada is Protestant. The United States, of course, the majority of people in the United States are Protestant. It's about 30% Catholic in the United States, which means all the rest of them are either nothing or they're Protestant, pretty much. There are some Muslims, there are some Hindus, and some Buddhists. But the vast majority of people in the United States, these are Catholics. Worldwide distribution of Catholicism. Degree of individualism exists in Protestant countries compared to other countries. The 6 most individualistic countries in the world are largely Protestant, whereas the least individualistic Western societies are largely Catholic, and that's just the way it works. So Catholic countries, the people do work. Of course they work. That's the only way they could make money, but they don't work to the extent that the Protestant countries do. Countries dominated by various Asian religions also tend to score low on individualism. Pronounced differences in embracing an intrinsic work ethic were observed between Western European Catholics and mainstream Protestants, as evident in a measure of work values. So the Protestant work ethic is very strong in Protestant countries. The Protestant ethic has been associated with negative attitudes toward laziness and being overweight, as weird as that sounds. So what does laziness and being overweight have to do with it? You're not working hard enough. So the Protestant work ethic has to do with working hard, and of course, if you work hard, then you're not going to be fat. You're not going to be overweight. That's the idea. McClelland in 1961 found that Protestant parents expected their children to become self-reliant at an earlier age compared with Catholic parents. So Catholic parents kind of wanted their kids to stick around. They didn't want them to become independent, too young in life. But Protestant parents, they want their kids to graduate high school, and at that juncture, they would kick them out of the house. I told you the story of my dad. When my dad graduated from junior high school, his father, my grandfather, told him that he either needed to get a job, he needed to start paying room and board, is what my grandfather told him. He needed to start paying room and board. Of course, my grandfather only had an education up to the 3rd grade, and he felt that that was enough. But my dad wanted to go to high school. So in order for my dad to go to high school, he had to find a job at nights and on the weekends so that he could pay his father room and board. Now, the interesting thing is, this is during the Depression, and my dad found a job at a grocery store, and he was really good at it. Loved grocery stores. To the end of his dying day, he loved grocery stores. And he would walk through groceries. He'd go to the grocery, and he'd be there for 3 and 4 hours just walking around the aisles to see how they put things together, see where they put the produce, to make sure that it was fresh. Just like he was still a grocery store person. My dad was a banker, and he would spend hours in the grocery store. It was funny. You didn't want to go to the grocery store with my dad. He knew where everything was. That wasn't the problem. The problem was he would wander around in the grocery store, and everybody knew him.
It's kind of like me in restaurants.
You like restaurants?
I used to work in restaurants.
Ah.
And I just know how things operate and everything like that, so.
So I don't want to go to the restaurant with you.
Yeah,
It would take me
I would want to sit there and conversate while you're talking. I'd be looking around and guessing, I bet you this is like this. And I could sit there for hours and tell you how everything operates and how this person feels. And
And it was really kind of curious that my grandfather wanted my dad to pay. But I was saying that he worked in a grocery store during the Depression, and of course they ran out of food. But my dad never ran out of food, because if something expired, he'd take it home and he'd cut the bad part off and they'd have it for dinner, you know. So they ate fairly well during the Depression, whereas other people, you know, they were starving to death. But my dad worked in a grocery store, and it's not like he stole the food. He would take it home if it was expired, if they would have thrown it out.
salvage.
Yeah, he salvaged it.
Yeah.
There you go. That's a good word for it. McClelland in 1961 investigated the stories written by young boys and found that those written by German Protestants had more evidence of strong achievement motivations than those written by German Catholics. Now, why in the world do I have this picture up here? Because Germany supports 2 churches in the country. The government supports 2 churches. They support the Lutheran Church and they support the Catholic Church. So every village in Germany has 2 churches. At one end of the street they will have a Catholic church, and at the other end of the street they have the Lutheran Church. As weird as that sounds, or the Protestant Church. They call it the Protestant Church, but it's actually the Lutheran Church. How can you tell the difference? The Lutheran Church has a steeple, and that's the difference between the churches. This is a Catholic cathedral, and that's a Lutheran church. It's bizarre. So you can go into any town, and actually if you're wandering through the United States and you go to a town in Nebraska or Iowa or Kansas, you can tell if it's a Lutheran town or if it's Episcopalian town or a Catholic town by how tall the steeple is. Lutherans have really tall steeples. And the reason they do is because the idea is that the taller the steeple, the easier it will be to get to heaven. It's not like you have to climb up there to go to heaven. It's funny because you'll drive around Nebraska, and if you see a steeple, you know it's a Lutheran town, or at least it has a Lutheran church. Really
I've
bizarre.
always wondered that, why these churches have like different structures and buildings.
Oh,
Some
sure.
of them have like
pictures and them and stuff like that. I know the Catholic Church, look at you guys like that.
Yeah.
They have, like pictures of
Right.
people and stuff like that.
Yeah, well,
And some of them are just like fancy, but then they have that
Tall steeple.
Yeah, and some of them are short, and some of them look like.
right. Yeah, you drive into Chinle, and that blue church that's in that little town before you get to Chinle,
Oh yeah.
the blue church, that's a Presbyterian church. Why is it a Presbyterian church? Well, it's a Presbyterian church because it's a Presbyterian church, but it doesn't have a steeple. Like, it has a bell, but it doesn't really have a steeple. Then you drive into Chinle, and they've got that log church, and it doesn't have a steeple either. It's not a Lutheran church either. It's something. It's another Protestant denomination.
That's Catholic.
That's a Catholic church.
That's a Catholic church.
All right. Ullman, Tannenbaum, and Barr in 2011 primed a group of Americans and a group of Canadians with salvation words or neutral words, and then gave them a task to do. The Americans were primed with salvation words, worked harder on the task than those who were primed with neutral words. Canada's kind of an interesting country. It started out as French after they kicked all the Indians. Actually, they didn't kick them out. They were using them. So it started out as French, and of course the French are Catholic. Then the English took over. They won the French and Indian War, and then the English took over. Well, the English just have one sanctioned church, and that's the Church of England. In the United States, it's referred to as the Episcopalian Church. But up in Canada, the same damn church, the same church is the same church is the Church of England. So if you go to Canada, the sanctioned church in Canada is the Protestant Church of England instead of the Catholic Church, which of course has to do with the French.
The church in Canada is Protestant.
Yeah, Canada supports the Protestant church.
So the majority of the churches in Canada are Protestant.
Yeah, but you don't have to be, you can be anything, of course, but the sanctioned church that is supported by the government is the Church of England.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So it is
I thought like French would rule majority of.
no, the French are way over in the east.
The east,
They're in
okay.
Montreal, Toronto.
Yeah, okay.
Those are both French towns.
Okay.
French cities, I'm sorry, did I say town? I meant city.
Yeah.
But that's the only place that, Quebec is pretty much is where French Canadians live. They live in the eastern part. But, so when all of the immigrants came into Canada, they started out on the east coast, of course, but there was no land, so they just kept moving west. So if you go to Saskatchewan or Manitoba or British Columbia in the west, it's primarily immigrants. So there's a lot of Ukrainians and Lithuanians and whatnot in the western part. But in the eastern part, you have the old portions of Canada, and that's where the French Canadians come from. I'm sure if I were Canadian, I would be much better able to talk about this. But a lot of people came to the United States for religious freedom. So we had all of these strange splinter churches came into the United States, different religions, and that's one of the reasons why we have so many denominations in the United States. We have Methodists and Baptists and Episcopalians and Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and the Church of God, Church of Christ, Church of Latter-day Saints. We've got all of these different churches. But the United States doesn't have a sanctioned church. The government doesn't pay for a church to be established. But Canada only has the one. They only have the one Protestant church. Now they have Methodist churches and they have Baptist churches. But the vast majority of Protestant churches in Canada are the Church of England, what we would call Episcopalian. Okay, all right. Okay, so now this gets really interesting because people, when they came to the United States, they did it for religious freedom. So we have all of these interesting Protestant groups, and so they had this developed Protestant work ethic. And because they have this Protestant work ethic, they've got a different mindset. So there's a different mindset in Canada than there is in the United States, because here we have no control. We have total religious freedom down here. Up there is a degree of control, and that control has to do with the fact that if you're not very religious at all, you still go to church on Sunday, and you go to the Church of England. So it's the main idea. The main church in Canada is the Church of England. So, people in the United States have a different mindset. So he did this exercise. The Americans who are primed with salvation words. So in the United States, we use a lot of the religious verbiage. We talk about salvation all the time. We talk about these things, and it becomes part of our lexicon. It becomes part of our verbiage, part of the words that we use. Many of the words that we use have to do with our religious ideas. And since there's more religious freedom in the United States, not that they don't let you worship the way you want to in Canada, but in the United States, of course, you've got to select your own. You've got to grasp it, and you've got to hold on to it. So a lot of people are very religious, as is evidenced by the evangelicals that voted for Donald Trump in the last election. Okay, so there's a lot of religious fundamentalists in the United States. There's a Pentecostal movement in the United States. So we have all of these ideas, and they become part of our lexicon. We've come up with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation. Once upon a time, under God was not in there. In the 1950s, they put it in there because there was a movement in the United States an evangelical movement in the United States. So because of that, and because of the Korean War, and because the communists were godless, they put in under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. It wasn't there before. The Pledge of Allegiance was written in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century. They've been saying it the same way for 50 years, and then during the Korean War, because we were facing off with the communists, they put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay.
Meaning that under God, we're all as one now?
I'm sorry?
Like, the reason why they put under God in there was because they all united as one?
They put under God in there because they were trying to show that they weren't godless.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. And this was during the McCarthy era, when they were trying to weed out all the communists in the United States. So they put under God in there. It was a way to show that you were not communist. Because as far as they were concerned, communists were godless. But of course, as we found out after the wall fell down and the Bolsheviks, who became the communists, once the wall fell down, they started going to church just, like everybody else in the world. They started going to church, which was a little surprise to everybody, because propaganda-wise, we were telling the world that communists were all godless. And the government was not in favor of supporting religion. But our government doesn't support religion either. Well, it actually does, but we pretend it doesn't. So the Americans who were primed with salvation words worked harder on the task than those who were primed with neutral words. So we took a whole pile of Americans, and some of them we used these salvation words with, and others we primed them with neutral words. The ones with neutral words didn't work as hard as the people that were primed with salvation words. In other words, it primed them for this Protestant work ethic to come out, as weird as that sounds. Okay, now let's talk about the Canadians. The American results indicate that notions of hard work and salvation are implicitly linked for Americans, and that's because of all this religious freedom that I was talking about. This pattern occurred regardless of whether or not the American participants were religious, providing some evidence for Weber's claim that ideas about predestination become secularized and thus part of the American cultural fabric. So despite the fact that you could be religious or not religious, it really didn't make any difference. This has become part of our lexicon. This has become part of who we are. It has become part of our culture, that we are hardworking people, and we use these salvation words to trigger that, that work ethic, that Protestant work ethic. Now let's look and see what happened with the Canadians. Now weirdly enough, of course, I have a picture of hockey players. Okay, Canada, get it? Hockey Canada.
Yeah.
The Canadian participants did not work any harder when primed with ideas about salvation, suggesting that an implicit link between salvation and working was not evident in Canada. But then again, Canada has a different religious history than we do in the United States. Ours is totally free. We have all these really strange evangelicals, we have Pentecostals, we have different groups of individuals that are screaming and beating on the Bible and telling us that we're going to go to hell if we don't do everything the right way. But in Canada, you don't have that because you have a state religion. You have the Church of England. I think it's still called the Church of England up in Canada. So the Canadians don't get the same message that we get in the United States. As a matter of fact, if the salvation words were used with the Canadians as well, but they didn't respond to it. Americans do, because that's part of our lexicon. It's written on all of our money. In God we trust. It's in the Pledge of Allegiance that we have to say every day when we're in elementary school. With this whole concept of God. It doesn't matter whether you are actually religious or not, you still have to spend the money and you still have to repeat the Pledge of Allegiance. And it says in there, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Canadians don't have a Pledge of Allegiance, well, not that I'm aware of anyway. And even if they did, I'm not sure it would say anything about God in it. So there you go, okay. So religion is really important, and it's important to you. You know, I talk about growing up in a Methodist town all the time and being an atheist, but the reality is, despite the fact that I have no religious background and no spirituality that I talk about, it's still part of who I am. I can't get away from it because it is part of the American lexicon. Cohen, Kim, and Hudson in 2014 induced male American Protestants, Jews, and Catholics to imagine their sisters in sexual situations that they then, and then they had them do sculptures. Okay, so they thought about their sisters having sex. Do you have any sisters?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
A lot of them.
So yeah, you have a lot of them?
Yeah.
How many sisters do you have?
Well, I got one biological sister and a whole bunch of them. My mom's side.
Okay. So what they did, they took these people, Protestants, Jews, and Catholics, and they told them to think of their sister having sex. Okay. The Protestants were judged as working harder on their sculptures than the Jews or the Catholics or the Protestants not primed by depravity about their sisters. It's a sin to think of your sister. It's a sin. It's taboo for Navajos to think about sex, about especially your sister having sex.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Of course it is. Well, it's a taboo. Every group of people have taboos.
Except for
What? What, ancient Egyptians?
Angelina Jolie and her brother.
She had sex with her brother?
Yeah, didn't she date her brother before she hooked up with the guy from Bad Santa?
I don't know.
yeah, she was
I
dating
don't
her
know
own
about
brother.
about Angelina Jolie and her brother?
Yeah.
They dated each other?
They dated each other.
Oh golly! I wonder if they had sex. The researchers concluded that it was the depraved thoughts that induced the Protestants to work harder. So if you're Catholic and you do something wrong, you have impure thoughts, what do? You go to the priest, you confess, and then the priest tells you to do something, and then you're absolved of all your sins. As cool as that is. The Jews don't believe in sin. So they, despite the fact they're thinking sexual thoughts about their sisters, doesn't mean anything to them. But Protestants, they have all this guilt that they have created. And the only way that they can absolve it is to work it out. They need to get rid of it. Catholics, all you need to do is go to the priest and he tells you to say 5 Hail Marys and 3 Our Fathers and you're good to go. So you can absolve yourself, but Protestants, they have to work their sins out. They have to correct their sins by doing something that is positive, so that they can it's like addition and subtraction. So because they've sinned, that's -7. So now they have to work really, really hard so that they get an 8, so that -8 minus 7 equals 1. Now they're ahead by 1. Okay, phew. They still get to go to heaven. That's the way it works in the Protestant religion. Are you excited about that? So you got to know what everything equals in order to figure out where you are.
I just feel bad for the Catholic priest.
Oh no, he gets to listen to all these really juicy stories, but he can't tell anybody what they are. We can see the world is fixed and beyond our control to change the entity theory of the world, or we can think of the world as flexible and responsive to our efforts to change it, and this is known as the incremental theory of the world. So we can see it as an entity theory or as an incremental theory of what the world is like. Rothbaum, Weiss, and Snyder in 1982 proposed that there are 2 ways to gain control of your life. People achieve a sense of primary control by striving to shape existing realities to fit their perceptions, goals, or wishes. Primary control. Primary control also goes under the related name of internal locus of control, influence, and agency. People achieve a sense of secondary control when they attempt to align themselves with existing realities, leave the realities unchanged, but exerting control over the psychological impact of these realities. Secondary control, also known as adjustment, is related to the construct of external locus of control. Your desires and goals adjust themselves to what your environment is most likely to provide. In other words, you really don't have control over your own environment. Your environment tells you how much control you're going to get. And this is the external locus of control. So you either have an internal locus of control, I have control over my own destiny, or you have an external locus of control. I got screwed by this guy and now I'm a failure, but it's his fault. It's not my fault, it's his fault. Internal locus of control, everything's my fault. External locus of control, I can blame somebody else. So if you're Catholic and you confess all your sins and you still go to hell, whose fault is it? Obviously it's the priest. He didn't tell you to say enough Hail Marys and Our Fathers in order for you to absolve you of all your sins. So it's his fault, damn it.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're Navajo.
Oh, if you're Navajo.
Yeah, as long as the priest is white. Yeah.
You're good to go. It's his fault. It's always the white guy's fault. I keep forgetting. It's always the white guy's fault. Weiss, Rothbaum, and Blackburn in 1984 see many socializing experiences in Japan that lead Japanese to be more comfortable with engaging in secondary control strategies. Now remember, the Japanese like to work for the same company all their lives. They work themselves to death for that company. They never complain about anything. That's the way the Japanese work. In the United States military, if you're in the US military, the one thing that you complain about is your officers, and the second thing you complain about is your sergeants, or sometimes it's the other way around. It's always their fault. So as Americans, we do blame other individuals. The Japanese, they don't. It's always somebody else is controlling them, so they have no control. Japanese infants spend much of their time in contact with their mothers and thus learn to adjust themselves to what their mothers are doing. American babies, of course, if they don't want to crawl around on the rug, they start crying and mom has to come pick them up. Japanese mothers, that's not the way it works. The Japanese babies adjust themselves to what the mother is doing so that the baby and the mother are in harmony. Japanese workers change jobs far less frequently than their Western counterparts, and it is not uncommon for workers to be promised lifetime employment, a system ensuring that employees learn to adjust themselves to whatever demands the company places on them. So potentially, I mean, people keep telling me I can work here until I'm as old as Wilson is. I think Wilson's 88, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So I can work 18 more years here. Well, who knows when he's going to retire? He keeps threatening every semester to retire, but he never does. So potentially I can just work for like the rest of my life here.
Yeah.
What's the probability, with all the crap that I say and all the trouble that I get into with the administration, what's the probability I'll last that long? What's the probability that I won't get fired? Can I last 18 more years here?
I think so.
Why? How can I? I'm not Navajo.
Well, it's obvious that the psychology program is lacking
Instructors.
Instructors.
As soon as we get enough instructors, guess who's out the door?
But once I get my master's degree,
You don't
it's
care.
hopefully-
As far as you're concerned, that's the end of it. You don't care. In a Japanese and American study where workers were asked to recount when they had been helped and when they had helped others, the Americans were better able to recall when they had influenced others. We think of times that make us feel good. The Japanese recalled far more times when they were assisted than when they helped someone else. So the Japanese mindset is totally different from the American mindset. There's little emphasis on making choices in life to people from India. Making choices seems to be more difficult for Indians than for Americans. Indians take significantly more time to make choices than do Americans. We just make choices. My daughter went to buy a new car, and she went to the car lot, and she picked out a car right there, right then. It wasn't what she was thinking she would buy, but she just picked it out. She was able to make a decision that rapidly. If she had been an Asian Indian, she would not have been able to make that decision. She would have pondered over it for weeks or months or maybe years before she would have bought a new car. Of course, she needed a new car. So I was happy she made such a rapid decision. Asian Indians don't respond as negatively when they are deprived of the opportunity to choose when compared with Americans. So if you had 2 bottles of pop sitting there and one of them was a Fanta orange and the other one was I don't know, what else do we want to drink? Cream soda, which tastes like bubble gum. If those were your only 2 choices, would you be happy about it? I don't know, do you drink soda?
Not much, I used to.
Which one would you take, the cream soda or the Fanta orange?
Fanta orange,
Okay.
yeah.
Good choice. Would you be happier if there was a Coke and a Pepsi and a Mountain Dew and
Yeah, more variety.
there you go, if you had more variety? Okay. See, as an American, that's what you want. If you were from Asia, if you were an Asian Indian, then you wouldn't want so many choices. You couldn't make a decision. It's not the way that you're raised. People in India, they only have a select number of choices. If they have too many choices, they can't make a decision. Asian Indians and people from numerous other non-Western cultures also indicate that they have less free choice in their lives compared with North Americans, but it doesn't bother them. They're happy with it. Choices do not appear to play as large a part in the lives of Asian Indians as North Americans. And as North Americans, well, I get upset when my drink is not available. I drink Code Red, Mountain Dew. the red stuff, that's good stuff.
Yeah, it is.
But if there's no code red there, what do I get? What's my next choice? Well, I don't have a next choice. Mountain Dew is okay, but it doesn't taste like anything anymore.
Yeah,
I need that blast of cherry, that blast
Yeah.
of cherry flavor.
I like drinking Code Red after all-night ceremony.
There you go.
Yeah.
Wakes you up.
Wakes me up, yeah. Tastes good too.
Tastes like cherries,
Yeah.
which is a good flavor, evidently. The more important the action, the more likely Americans were to identify as a personal choice, whereas the Asian Indians, the more important the action, the less likely they were to view it as a personal choice. When Americans are given an opportunity to choose something, they almost always select the option they prefer. I certainly do. If there were a Code Red sitting there and there was also all the other pops in the world, I would still pick the Code Red Mountain Dew. My second choice would probably be a yellow Mountain Dew, even though I don't really like it that much anymore. The link between preferences and choices isn't as tight among Asian Indians. They are less likely to choose their favorite option, as weird as that may seem. They still don't pick their favorite option. In learned helplessness, an individual feels that he or she is unable to control or avoid unpleasant events, and the person will suffer from stress and potentially depression because they can't escape from the bad situation. It's kind of like being in the military and not being having a good assignment, and you know that you're going to be there for 3 years. Learned helplessness. So you just kind of drift along because you're not really happy in your job because you're not happy. Personally, of course, I'll tell you what. I was stationed in Lubbock, Texas, and have you ever been to Lubbock?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Okay, it's not the nicest place in the world.
All towns in Texas look alike.
It sure looks like Amarillo, that's for damn sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
It looks like Wichita Falls too.
Amarillo that way.
Amarillo's north. It's in the
Amarillo,
panhandle.
then straight down south that way. All the towns look alike, but then from El Paso all the way down this way. Well, El Paso area is kind of like.
It's all desert
Yeah,
after
it's
El
all
Paso.
desert there.
I used to drive that route to go to Phoenix when I lived in Mississippi. My daughter lived in Phoenix, so I would travel the southern route to go to Phoenix.
But yeah, from Amarillo that way, it seems like.
It all looks the same.
Yeah.
Tucumcari even looks like Amarillo.
Same goes with Oklahoma
Sure.
and Arkansas.
I can't tell. I can't tell when I'm in Texas or whether I'm in Oklahoma because you're right. All the towns look exactly alike.
Yeah, Kansas too.
Yeah, Kansas is pretty damn flat.
Well, Kansas kind of has like that really old-fashioned city, it seems. Most of it.
Kansas used to be Indian territory.
Yeah.
Before they carved out Oklahoma. Actually, Oklahoma was already there, but Kansas was Indian territory. So was Nebraska. So when they moved all the Indians from the east, and they moved them across the Mississippi River, they kicked them into Missouri, into Oklahoma, into Kansas, and into Nebraska. Now there are already tribes there, they were hoping they'd kill each other off, which kind of happened a little bit. There were a lot of wars going on with all the movement. That's the way the federal government thinks. Oh, they'll be fine. They're all Indians, right? They can all get along. Hell, they didn't even speak the same language. A study by Oettingen and Seligman in 1990 found that East Berliners showed more signs of learned helplessness than the people on the other side of the wall in West Berlin, if you've ever been there. And I have. I was there in 1981 and 1982. I went to Berlin, and of course there was an East Berlin and a West Berlin. You couldn't get there because it was isolated. It was in the East German territory. So you had to either fly in, or you had to go in by troop train, or you had to drive in on the Autobahn. But if you drove in on the Autobahn, you had to stop at Russian checkpoints, and there were 3 of them. And they gave you just a select amount. You had like this 15-minute window to get from one place to the other, to get to the other checkpoint. They wanted to make sure you weren't spying on whatever is off the Autobahn, I guess. So they wanted to make sure you didn't stop. They wanted to make sure you got from one place to the other. So you had, you needed to get to the next checkpoint in 45 minutes. You either got there between, you couldn't get there too fast because then they knew you were speeding and they'd give you a ticket. So you had to get there just at a certain time in order for them to allow you to keep going on. I had a friend who got drunk and got on that Autobahn, and he made the mistake. He didn't have any orders, so he really couldn't be on the Autobahn. But he was drunk, and he was driving fast, and he was driving slow, and he missed all of his checkpoints. So by the time he got to the last checkpoint, he was way off his schedule, and they arrested him. But they couldn't arrest him because it was the East Germans that wanted to arrest him. And we didn't recognize the East Germans as being real. You know, we pretended they didn't exist. So he had to wait for the Russian military to come and arrest him. And so the Russians finally got there, they arrested him, but he was sitting there for like 12 hours. They busted him down. He was a E7, and they busted him down to E4 because he was drunk. He was in uniform. He was drunk in uniform. So it was really kind of funny. I met him when I was in Offutt Air Force Base up in Bellevue, Nebraska. Too funny. So he told me that story, and I can see that happening. My car had a leak in the radiator, so I was afraid I was going to break down someplace, and I had 3 kids in the back seat. So here I was with 3 kids, and I'm driving down the Autobahn. I've got a leaky radiator, and I stopped, and the Canadians were the Canadian Army were having exercises, and I asked them if they had anything to patch my radiator with, and they laughed. They thought it was the funniest thing in the world. Turns out they did have something to patch my radiator, but they wouldn't let me use it because I was an American and they were being really nice, like Canadians always are. So I just I got a little bit of extra water and I just took off. I made it. Everything was fine. It sealed itself, strangely enough. Snib and Marcus in 2005 argued that the upper middle class Americans are raised to favor choices and to express themselves through their choices. So as Americans, choices are very important to us. And we identify ourselves through our choices. They learn to respond quite negatively when they believe that they do not have any choice in a situation. So people were really excited about the primaries. We had so many choices in the Democratic field. Now we only have 3 left. There's only 3 people running for president. One of them doesn't have very many votes. It's really kind of weird. And the other 2 are neck and neck. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are neck and neck. Why Elizabeth Warren is still in the race, I'm not exactly sure. I can tell you, well, I know why she's in the race, because she's still got lots of money. But Bloomberg dropped out last night. Working class Americans grew up learning that much of what people encounter in life is beyond their control, and that a good way to maintain one's independence is to emphasize one's integrity and resilience during tough times. This is really kind of interesting because I grew up in a working class community in Indiana. Indiana has a lot of factories. They had a lot of automotive factories. And a lot of the people that I grew up with became factory workers. Their parents were factory workers. My first wife's father was a factory worker. They had a different mindset. Their idea was they had no control over anything. It was really kind of a little bit different. I always felt like I controlled my own fate. And for that reason, when I married my wife, she wanted me to do what a factory worker would have done. She didn't, I went to college, and she wanted me to drop out of school and go into the factory. I would have made a lot more money, as if money was the most important thing. It's one of the reasons we didn't get along. Factory workers used to get paid every Friday. And because they got paid on Friday, that meant that Saturday, Sunday, and maybe even Monday were holidays as far as they were concerned. They would go to the stores. This is before Walmart, when they just had Kmart. And they would go to the stores and they would spend all their money. And hopefully they didn't need anything when it came Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, because they wouldn't get any more money until Friday. Totally different mindset. I grew up on a farm. My dad was a banker, my mom was a nurse. They got paid every 2 weeks. Because of that, they taught us how to save money, but factory workers didn't do that. And for that reason, because they never accumulated any money, they didn't save anything, when the factories closed, they were SOL. They were in really bad shape. Ash's work in 1962 showed that Americans were more likely to conform to social pressure than not. 75% of Ash's American subjects conformed on at least one out of the 12 trials that they were in. Conformity in the United States is common. So if we had more than one Navajo in the room, if I had a whole seat full, if I had a whole section full of Navajos, the vast majority of the individuals would have on black, just like you do. You have a black coat on. I'm sure that you feel like you're part of the group. You're conforming, and that's always good. You should always conform. No, just kidding.
We're decolonizing.
Yeah. I was thinking about that. We'll talk about that in just a second. Ash's conducted other experiments dealing with conformity and found that there are several consequences to not conforming. People might laugh at you, and of course you don't want to be laughed at by your clan members, by your peers, by your elders. You certainly wouldn't want them to tell you that you did something wrong. And they would, wouldn't they?
Yeah, well, actually, we all laugh at each other a lot, so.
Yeah, right. I was talking to Greg today.
That's just how now we love to laugh at each other.
Yeah, I love to laugh at each other.
Not a hardcore, embarrassing way though, but we just like to joke around with each other.
Right, yeah. I've seen that a lot.
Yeah.
I was talking to Greg today, and he was talking about his family decided he should get married. And he was dating somebody at the time, and he had made up all these excuses. I don't have the money, I don't have a ring, I'm not exactly sure I want to marry this lady. And his family got together, and they provided him with a ring, they provided him with a dowry, and they forced him to marry the person that he was dating at the time. As interesting as that is. Now, of course, being non-Navajo, this would not happen in my family. My family could care less who I married, and probably would only have told me how they felt if they didn't like the person that I was getting married to. But in his case, of course, they forced him to get married.
Yeah.
It wasn't an arranged marriage. He married the person that he was dating, but they decided it was time for him to get married, so they made sure that he got married to that person.
That almost happened to me a couple of times. When you're with somebody for a certain amount of time, both families think that you guys are compatible or it's
Sure.
work out. They start saying
Correct.
stuff to force you into that and everything like that.
See, that wouldn't happen in my house.
Especially like if it's not even like in a year. But for me, I'm just like, it's not even been a year yet. I've been living with this person for a year yet, so I don't even know how they really are.
My son's been living with the same woman for about 10 years. And I would love to have grandkids, but I'm not going to pressure him. Because I know the more I pressure him, the less likely it's going to happen. So I just leave him alone.
Back in the day, yeah, people easily just hook up right then and there.
Yeah.
Respect that.
They lived it with each other, but they're not making any babies.
Respect and honor the marriage way of life. Nowadays.
Marriage way?
Yeah, nowadays it's a whole other story. A lot of options nowadays.
I guess. People tend to actively dislike those who don't conform, so it's a good thing you conform. It's a good thing you have on black,
Yeah.
because now you fit in with all those other Navajos out there with all their black clothes on.
Yeah. We're decolonizing slowly.
A meta-analysis of conformity studies shows that while Americans show a great deal of conformity, people from collectivistic cultures conform even more, especially when they are conforming to their in-groups. And of course, if we look at all the pictures from Japan, we see a lot of people that look exactly, or act exactly alike. Look at that. They're all, you would think they were praying, but they're not. They're not praying, they are being told what they're supposed to do for the day. So they're looking down in respect. Isn't that interesting?
And now they say not meaning look like they're pouting.
Well, they're Japanese. I don't know if the Japanese pout or not. Okay, and that's the end of chapter whatever.
Maybe that's why that's Navajo's like that.
Oh, the Japanese?
No, like when you talk to Navajos, they just kind of put their head down.
Oh.
They don't really make eye contact, direct eye contact. Oh, wow.
It's important to make eye contact. No, it's important in my culture that you make eye contact. Okay. How much time do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
I can cover lots. When stimuli are grouped according to the perceived similarity of their attributes, it is called taxonomic categorization strategy. Taxonomic categorization answers are especially common among Westerners. If we have these three elements, a rabbit, a dog, and a carrot, which would you put together? How would you categorize the rabbit, the dog, and the carrot?
Rabbit and carrot.
Rabbits eat carrots,
Yeah.
so you put them together, which leaves the dog out, which is okay. You wouldn't put the dog and the rabbit together because they're both mammals? No, that's okay. You've already done it. You've already put the rabbit and the carrot together. Makes a lot of sense.
I don't think that they would breed. But I know that the dog would.
They're the same
I know
size.
a dog would eat a rabbit, but.
Not that rabbit. I don't think. Thematic categorization strategies is where stimuli are grouped together on the basis of causal, temporal, or spatial relationships. Thematic categorization is especially common in East Asia. This difference in categorization strategies reflects an underlying difference in the way that people attend to their worlds. Analytic thinking is characterized by a focus on objects and their attributes. Objects are perceived as existing independently from their contexts. They are understood in terms of their component parts. Context is very important as far as analytic thinking is concerned. We are Westerners. Westerners think and they analyze things. So we think of things in their outside of their context. We see the trees. We don't see the forest. The forest is the context. We just see the individual trees. That's what we concentrate on, the individual trees. The attributes that make up objects are used as a basis for categorizing them, and at a set of fixed abstract rules is used to predict and explain the behavior of these objects. Analytic thinking is more common in Western countries than in China, Japan, and Korea. They see things in context. Everything is in context. Everything happens in context. We are Westerners. We analyze things by their individual function. That's the way we see things. Holistic thinking is characterized by an orientation to the context as a whole. It represents an associative way of thinking which gives attention to the relations among objects and the surrounding context. Holistic versus analytic thinking. When we think of an orange, we think of eating the orange. We think of the individual sections. If we were Eastern, if we were more holistic, we would think of the orange as an entire concept, including the rind and all the other stuff inside. In holistic thinking, objects are understood in terms of how they relate to the rest of the context, and their behavior is predicted and explained on the basis of those relationships. Holistic thinking also emphasizes knowledge gained through experience rather than the application of fixed abstract rules. Holistic thinking is more common, of course, in East Asia. Now, this is really important when we're talking about counseling, because if you have somebody who comes in who's a white person, then you can assume that they will they won't think in context, they will think as individual structures. They will think differently than if somebody comes in who's a Navajo. Navajos are more holistic thinking. You're more cyclical thinking. If you're a white person, then you think linearly. You think things start here and then they end up over here. But if you're Navajo, time is cyclical. So this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for me to understand why you guys are still talking about the long walk. It doesn't make any sense to me. That was 1864 through 1868. Why in the world are you still talking about that? You know, that doesn't have anything to do with you. But because you're Navajo and you are more holistic thinking, then this still impacts you. As a Westerner, it wouldn't impact me at all. A good example would be the Civil War. You know, what do I think about the Civil War? Well, I'm a historian, so I think about the Civil War, but does it have an impact on me? No, it doesn't have an impact on me at all, despite the fact that I had a relative that, the twin brother of my great-grandfather was captured at Chickamauga, and he was put in prison in Andersonville, and he died down there. And he was the identical twin brother of my great-grandfather. How important is that? Well, it's not important at all. It doesn't really mean anything. It's not like I'm going to be pissed off at my wife because she's from that area where Andersonville is right next to Macon, and and her people are from Macon. So potentially, her people were the ones imprisoning my great-grandfather, their great-great-uncle. So when I go home, am I going to punch my wife because her relatives might potentially have had something to do with the death of my great-great-uncle? And the answer is no. Hell no, I don't really care about that. That was 150 years ago. But as Navajos, you still talk about the long walk as if it happened yesterday afternoon. You still talk about your relatives that were potentially starved to death, or were raped, or died on the way. You still talk about that kind of stuff because you are more holistic thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay. That's why you blame all white people.
We like to blame you. Yeah, it just helps us.
Even though most white people weren't even here yet. They were still over in Europe.
But that's just how we make our connection.
There we go. It's good to make that connection. But it's a good thing that African Americans don't think the same way. Because if African Americans thought the same way, they would blame me for slavery. My people were Northerners. My people were abolitionists.
You know, that's one thing that I've always wondered. What you're talking about?
Yeah.
I see remembrances of our ancestors, these
Sure.
chiefs, leaders, whatever all happened back in the day.
Right.
But us Navajos have a saying that we are not to dwell on people that passed away
Right.
in our lives, because
Right.
it creates that evilness within us.
Sure.
And it bothers us, which creates depression, stress,
Right.
anxiety.
But you still think about the long walk.
But we still do it. And I'm wondering why. Why do people posting up faces of Chief Manuelito, everything like that?
Barboncito.
They're still talking about it. This institution still talks about stuff like that. What happened back in the day. But
Sure.
then there's a discipline involved in some of our stories that we are not to dwell in the past, but it's still happening.
This building is the NHC building. There's a picture of the guy that it's named after.
Yeah.
That shouldn't happen. I recognize that shouldn't happen, and I'm a linear thinking.
Yeah.
But you know, you guys are Navajos, you shouldn't have a picture of somebody, he's not with us anymore.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's so much confusion going on, it's just like. I can agree with what you're talking about, understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But we still gotta blame somebody.
So why not me? Okay,
Yeah.
good.